Good afternoon and welcome to the Federal Railroad Administration's Fiscal Year 2020 Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements, or CRISI, Grants Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, webinar. Today's agenda is listed on the screen. We'll have a CRISI program overview, the NOFO overview and how to apply. We will discuss best practices. We'll provide recaps and reminders, and then we will go into the Q&A portion. Today's speakers are Francis Bourne, Ruthie Americus, Nathan Vomasil, and Andrea Martin of the Federal Railroad Administration's Office of Railroad Policy and Development. Before I turn today's presentation over to Francis, we're going to have two polling questions for you. So let me go ahead and pull them up. The first polling question is, what type of organization do you represent? A, state, B, interstate compact, C, public agency or publicly chartered authority, D, local government, E, Amtrak, F, industry or consultant, or G, other. And we'll give that a few seconds. All right, thank you all so much for participating in our first poll there. And I'm going to pull up the second poll question that we have. This question is, have you participated in any previous discretionary grant program webinars? A, yes, I've participated in a live webinar. B, yes, I've watched a recorded webinar online. C, no, I have not previously attended or watched any webinars. So we'll give that a few seconds more. All right, thank you all so much for participating in our second polling question. And now I will hand over the presentation to Francis.
Great, thank you, Mary. So here's the question of the day. What does the application process look like for CRISI in the time of COVID? And the answer is that it looks almost exactly the same as it did when we were all still in our offices. We've had 4 years of appropriated money, and the money has gone up and down, but I want to highlight for you the $311 million that's available in this go-round. Of this amount, $81.25 million will be for rural projects, and there's a set aside for new intercity passenger rail right-of-way acquisition or track projects, and that's $45 million. The other big thing to highlight on this slide is that the deadline to apply is June 19th. Keep in mind the purpose of this program. The purpose is to fund projects that improve the safety, efficiency, and or reliability of intercity passenger and freight rail systems. So who can apply? There's a whole host of governmental entities, including states, cities, and counties, public agencies, which can include port authorities or transit agencies as examples, universities, the TRB, labor organizations, and Class 2 and 3 railroads. There is a new eligible applicant in this go-round, which is the Class 2 and 3 railroad holding companies. I do just want to say one word about public agencies. If you come in and apply under that eligibility category, we really would like to see your enabling legislation. There are some organizations that aren't self-evident that they're public agencies, and so it is very helpful if you can include your enabling legislation to prove your public agency status. So there's a whole wide range of capital projects to improve intercity passenger or freight rail that are eligible under this grant program. Grade crossing improvements, track projects, bridge repairs, and safety programs, research and workforce development. But again, keep in mind that grant purpose, which is for the safety, efficiency, and or reliability of intercity passenger or freight rail and or freight rail systems. This is an 80-20 program with a preference for projects that come in with a request of 50% or less federal funds. A number of registration questions were about how we could show more flexibility on these statutory requirements, and the answer is that Congress can change the program requirements. That said, spend time in the matching fund section of your application explaining the economic impacts of this pandemic, keeping in mind the minimum matching requirement is 20%. This slide explains our evaluation and selection criteria. We're looking at technical merit and project benefits in the evaluations. We're also looking for how your project applies the selection criteria. That means we're looking at readiness, private sector participation, whether your project is in the state rail plan or a state freight plan, what operational impacts the project will have, what the matching funds are and whether they're from multiple sources, what the benefits look like, whether there's private sector participation, and whether the project answers the key departmental objectives. Does the project prepare for future O&M costs? Does it include innovative approaches to safety or project delivery? Now I'll turn it over to Ruthie for some additional background.
Thank you, Frances. This is going to be a quick overview, and it will be familiar to some of you who have participated in our previous webinars, but specifically this will be for folks who are new to grants. So be sure you take a look at the NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, that Frances mentioned. This is the public announcement of the grant opportunity and provides information about the grant requirements as well as those important details on how to apply. If you go to our webpage, you'll see a link, and it is also listed in the Federal Register. So what information is in the NOFO? Here's a list of the different sections in the NOFO. Today we are specifically going to go over the items that are bolded: the eligibility information, the application and submission information, and the application review information. So again, for those who are new, the question is, where do I start? So to find information about FRA's grant programs, specifically the grant programs we are now accepting applications for, look on FRA's webpage on our discretionary grants programs. On that page, you will see the summary information about CRISI. This is the only grant program we are currently accepting applications for, but that can change at any point in time. You'll see a link in the NOFO that announces the grant opportunity in the Federal Register. Once you go to the Federal Register, you will see that this announcement was published on April 20th. Note the application due date, as Frances mentioned, is June 19th. Applications are due by 5 p.m. sharp on the 19th. If we receive any applications after that time, they will not be reviewed at all. So it is very important that you submit your applications early. Please do not wait until the last minute because these applications are time-stamped. Also, please notice the CFDA number 20.325. You can use that number at any time to find out more information during the application process. Now we'll move on to another polling question.
So our next polling question is, do you have experience using grants.gov? A, yes, extensive. B, yes, limited. C, no experience. And we'll give that just a few seconds more. All right, thank you all so much, and back over to you.
Thank you. So the next section is primarily for those who have limited or no experience using grants.gov. So after you've read the NOFO and decide that you meet the eligibility requirements that Francis went over, you'll need to access grants.gov to read the directions on applying electronically and finding other information about the grant opportunity. On grants.gov, you can search for the CRISI grant information by using the CFDA number, again I mentioned it 20.325, to go directly to the opportunity. There are other ways to search for all FRA grants, but this is the quickest way to search for the specific grant program. And then you can click on the opportunity number to see a synopsis of the grant program. The synopsis on grants.gov provides a summary of information about the opportunity. And if you look at the top right in red, that is where you'll start your application. But do note that before you start your application in grants.gov, you'll have to be sure that you obtain a Dun and Bradstreet number, DUNS number, and register in the Federal Registers in the Federal Government System for Award Management, the SAM management program. This is extremely important, and I strongly suggest that if you are not registered or do not have a DUNS number, you do this as soon as possible. The entities registering in SAM must submit a notarized letter appointing the authorized entity administrator. The SAM registration may take 2 or more weeks. You must have a DUNS and be registered in SAM prior to applying for the grant. So it's best to obtain a DUNS and then register in SAM, and then you can start working on other parts of your project application, your project narrative, and other sections of application outside of grants.gov. So once you are registered, you'll then be able to submit your document. As you prepare your application, be sure to focus on the required documents listed in the NOFO, particularly the project narrative and statement of work, 2 of the documents that our technical evaluators are looking at. Other important documents listed in the NOFO include the benefit cost analysis, which our economists review that is required for this grant program, and information and documentation on your environmental compliance. Here are the forms required in your application. You'll complete these electronically on grants.gov. So again, please be sure to give yourself ample time to complete all of these documents. You'll see you can get additional information on grants.gov in the bottom on the synopsis page. Okay, and so Francis went over a bit about the process, but we get a lot of questions about how long this is going to take, or if we have announced the selections yet. This is just a little bit about the process. Once we receive the applications, they are first reviewed for completeness and eligibility, those that were submitted on time. All of the applications that are complete and eligible then move on to the evaluation stage, and those are evaluated by a panel of DOT subject matter experts, and they use the criteria outlined in the NOFO. The information is all relayed to our selecting officials. We have a senior review team as well as our FRA administrator who makes their selection, and then those are reviewed and approved by the Secretary of Transportation. All of that takes some time before we make our announcement in the press release, so that can range from 4 to 5 months since we typically get a large number of eligible applications with the CRISI grant program. So it takes a while for us to go through all that whole process. So keep an eye out on the FRA webpage to see if that announcement has been made. And now I'm going to turn it back to Francis to talk about best practices to follow.
Great, thank you, Ruthie. Let's talk about some helpful hints. Number 1 is to read the NOFO. Ruthie mentioned 4 items that you need to include as part of your application. We've noticed that 3 of these areas could use some attention from our previous rounds. We're going to focus first on the project narrative. Here are all the requirements that you should include in your project narrative. Structure your project narrative in accordance with the outlines specified in the NOFO. Include all elements identified in the outline, follow the instructions for each element, and adhere to that 25-page limit. The cover page should have the chart outlined in the NOFO. This is hopefully one of the easiest parts of your project narrative. Don't forget to tell us if the project has been submitted previously to another grant program. In the project summary, your 4 to 6 sentence description should answer the journalistic questions of who, what, when, where, and why. At least one sentence should describe the benefits. As further guidance here, take a look at our past CRISI press releases to get an idea of top-level information to include. Think of this as your elevator speech to about the project to the DOT Secretary and the FRA Administrator. On project funding, we'd like to see detailed information about where your non-federal match is coming from here. This is where to discuss any COVID-related impacts or uncertainty. Only include eligible cost, specify each source of non-federal match, provide details about any in-kind match, indicate your public versus private sector match, describe the non-federal funding arrangements, and attach commitment letters, and identify if the proposed match will not be available until a certain date or if funds must be spent by a certain deadline. Now I'm going to skip 4 and 5 since I already covered applicant and project eligibility earlier. On the detailed project description, here's where you hone in on your project here. Quantify whenever possible, for example, using traffic volume or trip time savings. Highlight the benefit and cost, even if they're already in your benefit cost analysis, because those are two different sets of evaluators that are looking at those materials, the project narrative versus the benefit cost analysis. Include photos and diagrams. And if your application is for work on a railroad that you do not own, identify the host railroad and what agreements you have in place. For the project location, identify the city, county, and state where the project is located. Include a map of the project, and Google Maps is a good tool to use here. Identify railroad mileposts, and for grade crossing projects, please be sure to include the US DOT National Highway Rail Crossing Inventory number. Our evaluators want me to tell you that you can write your own evaluation if you address all of the evaluation and selection criteria. Include a separate section in the project narrative focused on how the project meets each one of the evaluation and selection criteria. And please don't rely solely on the contents of the detailed project description section to satisfy this requirement. It's okay to repeat key points in this section. And whenever possible, quantify your benefits. For project implementation and management, highlight your past experiences managing and overseeing similar projects, including FRA or DOT-funded projects. Describe expected arrangements for project contracting, contract oversight, change order management, risk management, and conformance with federal requirements for progress reporting. Short resumes are beneficial here. Telling us about the key personnel is one of the ways we determined project readiness. And lastly, on environmental readiness, Andrea will elaborate further regarding environmental readiness in a bit, so I won't repeat that here. Let's talk about your statement of work. Use FRA's standard cost categories as a way to organize the scope of work and budget, and the web link is here. Make sure your dates and amounts match what you have in the project narrative. Organize the scope of work into discrete and logically sequenced tasks. Provide appropriate timing for tasks. Identify the deliverables required to communicate progress and completion of tasks to FRA. Check the budget to ensure numbers are consistent with cost information submitted in forms and other areas of the application. Our engineers, regional managers, and other subject matter experts on the evaluation team review the statement of work to determine readiness. So now I'll turn it over to Mary for poll number 4.
Thank you, Frances. All right. The next polling question is, do you have experience preparing a benefit cost analysis? A, yes, extensive. B, yes, limited. C, no experience. And I'll just give that a few seconds more. All right, thank you all. So it looks like about 47% have limited experience, 36 have no experience, and 16% have extensive. Okay, back over to you.
So I'm going to be going over the BCA and kind of the steps of how to develop one. Even if you are having an outside consultant do the BCA for you, it's still important for you to know kind of the general process so that you can review their work. A lot of times we just kind of get people who don't really understand what a good BCA should look like, and so they're not able to really hold their contractors accountable. So these are the basic steps of the BCA. You need to define the base case, the alternate case, and the timeline that you are looking at. You need to show how specifically that alternate case or that project that you are constructing is going to result in specific effects, which we call the project benefits. You then need to take those effects and break them down into kind of the smallest possible elements so that you can monetize those using the Department of Transportation's BCA guidance. And then finally, there's a little bit of math that's also covered in the BCA guidance. That's pretty easy. So the first step is to determine the scope of your analysis. It's very important that your base case be the world as it exists today. We're not interested in things that may come to fruition or things that are in planning process but are not currently being built. And the alternate case is what you are specifically proposing to do with the money that you are receiving. If your project is a series of larger projects or some sort of overarching project of projects, you need to be focused on what specifically the money that you are applying for will achieve as your alternate case. There are a few exceptions to that, which I will go over, but generally speaking, only limit yourself to what the actual dollars you are requesting will fund. And finally, the timeline needs to be appropriate for the project that you are proposing. It should match the useful life of the project. In many cases, especially for rail projects, that will be longer than 30 years, but DOT guidance is that you limit yourself to 30 years. And so any remaining useful life that exists at the end of that period is counted as a project benefit using, simple accounting depreciation rules. So it is extremely important that when you are looking at the base case and the alternate case, or again, what currently exists and what you are proposing to construct or to do, you only look at the differences between those two states of the world. Any other sorts of possibilities are not of concern to us. Like if there are other alternate cases that you declined to take but you did consider, those are not relevant to the purpose of the BCA. And your differences, those differences should reflect the most realistic projections that you can give us, and it's important to document those projections in as much detail as possible. So if you see on the left, there's just a couple examples of some common errors that we see, some common sorts of assumptions that people make that are incorrect, and these would be the more correct versions of those assumptions. These aren't going to be true in every case. There might be, for example, in the second one, there might be some specific reason why you can't simply just impose speed restrictions on that particular piece of track, like that it has to be shut down completely. Like, for example, it's on a bridge and the bridge is unsafe to carry any traffic whatsoever, etc. In those cases, please just document in as much detail as possible why your particular circumstance is an exception to kind of a general common sense assumption. And then we won't have any problem accepting that. So occasionally these effects of the alternate case are negative. Any negative effects should still be included in the project benefits section on the B side of the BCA analysis. And they should be shown as negative dollars, so they're going to be subtracted from benefits rather than added to costs. The exception to that rule is operations and maintenance costs for new equipment, new construction, new bridges, etc. If you are replacing existing infrastructure or existing equipment, and it will result in a change of existing O&M costs, that net change can be resulted as a project benefit. So if you are buying new, coach cars for your passenger service, and you can, save money on O&M because these coach cars are newer and operate better, that is included in your project benefits. However, if you're starting brand new service or you're adding to your existing service with brand new cars, you need to add the O&M costs of that equipment to the overall costs in your BCA analysis. So the development of the BCA itself happens in this next step. The process from taking your broad overarching general effects and breaking them down into the specific effects, which you can then turn into dollar amounts, that's where 90% of your work needs to actually be done. Right? It's a fairly involved process, and making sure that you are covering all of your bases is very important to making sure that you get the full amount of benefits which your project is due. So a common example that we see is replacement of bridges. We have a large bridge, state of good repair deficit in this country, so it's a project we see fairly often. And as you'll see over here, there's several different ways. Instead of just saying, hey, replacing this bridge will save us time and will improve emissions, there's 3 different ways in which those travel time savings and emissions can be quantified, and each of them would actually be monetized in a different way because of what they involve. And by breaking things down into those more finite, granular sub-elements, the BCA reviewers are going to be more confident that your analysis is correct and that we should just go ahead and accept the conclusions that you have come to. So the finer the detail, the better. It's generally not going to be acceptable to just say, we're going to save a bunch of time, things will be better, trust us. We need, data, assumptions, calculations. If your data is different than the national data, please include it. If you don't, we will be going off national averages, national costs, which are not necessarily appropriate, especially for class 2 and 3 railroads. You often face very different costs than the class 1s, but we don't know that. So if you don't include your own information, we will be forced to use what we do have, which could penalize you. So please be aware of that. Modal diversion is a very common benefit that we see in this process, but it's important to remember that modal diversion is a marginal choice, and you should only count the marginal benefits, i.e. the difference between the base state and the alternate state. So, for example, if you are pulling trucks off the highway with your freight project, there's going to be a lot of benefits to the current users of the freight system and potentially to shippers and the railroad itself. So as you can see, there's a couple examples over there of the different types of effects that it might have. However, as you can see up there in the second point, if these are new users to your service, whether it be a freight service or whether it be passengers on your passenger rail, DOT guidance is that they value that service less than the existing users, as evidenced by the fact they weren't using it before you made these changes. And so you do need to follow the BCA guidance on that. Roughly, the most important rule would be the 50% rule, but that is well covered in the BCA guidance. And one final note on that issue is that for passenger rail, revenue losses faced by the operator are not in fact benefits. Like avoiding, like, hey, if we keep this service running, we're not going to be losing out on all this passenger revenue. And the reason for that is those people all get to keep their money. And they then have to go find whether or not, do they choose to take that same trip via another mode, which is going to cost them time and money and all of that stuff. So you can capture the overall effect, but the revenue loss itself is not a benefit. It is a transfer because it stays in the pockets of the people who would have otherwise used your systems in a perfect one-to-one ratio. So that is something that is a common error that we see. Please don't commit it and then find yourself shocked if you are penalized. So finally, just to kind of sum up, it is extremely, extremely important. It cannot be stressed enough that you include as much information as you can on your assumptions, what those assumptions are based on, any additional data that you can provide us that undergirds those assumptions. We are not aware of the circumstances in everyone's case, and if you are making certain assumptions about anything that any sort of future-looking forecast, please document in as much detail as possible so that we can have confidence that you're not just making numbers up. There's no such thing as too much information for the BCA purposes. As I mentioned in the beginning, if the project has separate elements, if it's part of an overarching project of projects, you need to include the benefits and costs of each sub-project separately so that they can be evaluated on an independent basis. It is often the case that due to how much funding is available, when they slice and dice things, you might get partial funding if you've done this, but usually not if you have just included the entire project as one overall BCA analysis. And finally, if you do include modal diversion, you need to include your passenger counts and your average daily traffic for the affected routes, and also freight counts if you have those. We generally do not have up-to-date information on those things. We rely on the state DOTs, and quite frankly, they're not always up-to-date. I've seen some that are listed in our database that haven't been updated since the 70s. So please do not rely on your state DOTs to provide that information, and just go ahead and provide it yourself. And all of this information needs to be included in an Excel spreadsheet with the calculations included so that we can go through and double check all of your math and make sure that you haven't made any major errors. There's a couple resources that we have. The first link is the benefit cost analysis guidance that comes from the Office of the Secretary. And the second one is something that we've prepared at FRA that's just kind of like a frequently asked questions. It gives a little bit more context, on how to apply the BCA guidance to rail-specific examples. We are also available for kind of general questions, and our contact info will be provided at the end. And now I will pass it over to Andrea for environmental.
Thanks, Nate. For the next couple of slides, I'm going to go over best practices for environmental readiness for your grant application. My email information will be at the end of the presentation today if you have any questions or need help with any of the links that I'm going to provide. So I know everyone has heard NEPA before, and the environmental process, most commonly referred to as NEPA, is required for all FRA grant-funded projects. to document and substantiate our agency's decision to implement the project. Anytime that there's federal dollars involved with a project, whether it's at FRA or FHWA, any agency out there, the federal agency, NEPA is involved with the federal, or tied to that federal dollar. So with your CRISI grant application, if you have an approved NEPA document for your proposed project, please include it with your grant application. This could be a FTA categorical exclusion or an environmental assessment at FHWA, but if your project was identified or your location has been studied, please include that information with your application. I believe what Nate said in his part of the presentation, more information the better, to make sure that the reviewer and the people at FRA understand, okay, this is what the project is, this could be the impact, or this is what the area is where that project's located. If there are no previous NEPA documentation or studies associated with your project, you're encouraged to consider the following in the grant application to the best of your knowledge. Basically, know your project location, know what your project is going to do, and any possible impacts to the human environment. That could be if maybe it's in a historic district, or there are known properties within the area that your project's going to be built. Protected populations, that could be, let's say your project is increasing rail traffic through a neighborhood, or maybe there's a hospital or a school located near your proposed project, and that could trigger some noise and vibration issues. The natural environment is natural environment. Let's say you know your project will go through some wetlands. It's really, even if you don't know if they're wetlands, but your project, your area maybe is cause flooding happens there. Let's say that you're doing a bridge replacement or bridge repairs, and you know that there's bats that live in the bridge. That could be actually a habitat for protected species. So those are things that to consider, even if you don't have a study on them. You know your project area, and you know you can document, hey, there are wetlands there, there's bridges that need to be replaced that could have bats, that type of information. And any permitting needs, let's say you are working on a bridge that's in waterways, that may be consultation, or we may need to talk to the Army Corps of Engineers or the Coast Guard if there are permits needed. So that's just to note that if in order to build your project, there might be permits that are required. And all of this is actually documented or on our FRA website. I highly encourage you to, with your CRISI grant application, to look at our categorical exclusion guidebook that's on the FRA website, because all of the resource areas are listed out there, and where you can find more information about that, as well as a blank categorical exclusion worksheet. And even if you don't have a previous NEPA study, you can certainly go through the categorical exclusion worksheet and fill some information in there that will let your FRA grant reviewer who is reviewing the applications know that you actually have an idea of where your project is, what the location is, what is out there, meaning it's in an urban area or it's in an agricultural area, if it's going to be going over waterways, that type of information. So here are two web links, and that you can get that categorical exclusion website, or rather the guidebook, from the first link. It's FRA and NEPA documentation. You can actually read about the different types of NEPA documents that we do process at FRA. The main FRA environment homepage, there's actually a list of environmental assessments and environmental impact statements, which are larger, more complex types of projects. We have a list of links and to bring you to project pages, so you can read, oh, these people built a bridge, or they replaced a historic bridge, how do they do it? Or if you're interested in those types of projects, just as examples. And then on the The second link is FRA recommended trainings and environmental resources. I'm the one who's responsible, so you can always email me and give me suggestions, or if you can't find something, I'd be happy to walk you through that part of the application process, just to get you guys started. If you have any problems, I'm happy to help. But the second link or the second bullet there, there's places where I've put up some information where there's online resources on how to fill in sections of the different types of environmental resources and impacts there that may be helpful to you, and some recorded webinars on the NEPA process, or links to different project development web resources that FRA has. So I'm always working on updating the website and getting it up to date, so there's tools there for you to use. And I think that's my section. So back to Frances on recaps and reminders.
Great, thanks, Andrea. So let's just go right into recaps and reminders. So number one, always read the notice of funding opportunity carefully. Determine what a successful project will look like. Use that checklist with the application requirements in the NOFO as you complete your application. Address all of the evaluation and selection criteria. And by directly and clearly responding to these criteria, your evaluation will be easier, your application will be easier to read and evaluate. Verify that all budget figures match corresponding figures cited in different parts of your application package. I can't stress this enough. Most of these recommendations, I know, sound like statements of the obvious, and yet we see applications time and again that don't take the time to edit, double check, and I know there's a limited amount of time and you need to make sure you get your application and all your materials in on time, but please do double check those numbers. Name your key partners, indicate your in-place agreements, include letters of support, and have, if you have time, I recommend you build in time for this to have an objective cold reader, someone who hasn't seen the application materials, read through your final document before you submit it. And lastly, I'll just say, please make sure to submit your application earlier than the deadline, which is 5 p.m. on June 19th. We're going to turn it over to Ruthie to talk a little bit about the grant life cycle.
Okay, great. Thanks, Frances. We get a lot of questions on the timing of grant awards once projects are selected. Sometimes the timing of this takes a little longer. Sometimes it takes a little less than this estimate. So these are just an approximate, this slide right here. So if your project's selected, you will be working with a regional manager who will contact you once your project is selected. You'll have a team of folks that include a grant manager and other subject matter experts who will help you throughout the process. Prior to the time that the funds are obligated and the time that you actually sign your agreement, you'll have to refine your statement of work, schedule, and budget. You will also need to complete your performance measures. In addition, the environment compliance requirements and grant terms and conditions must be completed and approved prior to the obligation of the funds. Again, this can take between 6 to 12 months, so do realize that this can take some time. Also factor this into your application when you are working on a potential start date for your project. Once the grant agreement is signed and the funds are obligated, we can start with a grant administration, which involves your project starting, deliverable and invoice reviews, and monitoring. And this time frame can really range. It's typically between 2 and 4 years, but it can be very different. Once the period of performance ends, we can start with the project closeout process, and that consists of final invoicing and reporting. So this is a little synopsis on the grant life cycle and the approximate time frame. So just keep this chart handy when thinking about the timing for your project.
Well, that's the longest webinar we've done on this, so thank you for your interest, and good luck on your applications.